Today we are going to be looking at US foreign policy between 1945 and 1965. This means we're going to have to go back in time. But not that far back in time, a little bit more recent than that. Between 1945 and 1965, the Middle East became increasingly important to American foreign policy. The region mattered because of its oil, its strategic position between Europe, Asia and Africa, and because the United States feared that newly independent states might move towards the Soviet Union during the Cold War. But how successful was American foreign policy? On the surface, the US achieved some significant victories. It expanded its influence as British and French power declined, successfully intervened in Iran, supported anti-Soviet governments and alliances, and became the dominant Western power in the region. However, these successes came with major contradictions. American actions sometimes damaged its reputation, increased anti-Western sentiment, and even pushed countries closer to the Soviet Union. My argument is therefore that American foreign policy in the Middle East was often tactically successful but strategically inconsistent. The US was effective in achieving immediate objectives, but these victories did not always translate into lasting political influence. The Suez Canal crisis of 1956 demonstrates this contradiction better than any other event in the period, and in the course of this video we'll be diving into that event in more depth. After the Second World War, many Middle Eastern countries were gaining greater independence, while Britain still maintained considerable military and economic influence. Initially, according to my course notes, Truman was relatively hands-off in the Middle East compared with Eisenhower, who adopted a much more interventionist approach. One early Cold War confrontation occurred in Iran. Soviet and British forces had occupied different parts of the country during the war. When the war ended, both were supposed to withdraw, but Soviet forces remained in northern Iran and supported autonomous areas in Azerbaijan and Kurdish territory. Iran threatened to appeal to the United Nations, and Soviet forces eventually withdrew. This was an early example of the basic objective that would increasingly define American policy, preventing Soviet expansion into a strategically important region. At the same time, the United States became involved in the question of Palestine. President Truman personally supported the creation of a Jewish state, and the United States supported the 1947 United Nations partition proposal. Israel declared independence in May 1948, followed immediately by war with neighbouring Arab states because of this decision to create a Jewish state. So even before Eisenhower, America was becoming increasingly connected to politics of the region. Iran and Operation Ajax. In 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh became Prime Minister. Britain had dominated the Iranian oil industry, while Iran received only a minority of its profits. Mossadegh nationalised the oil industry, and Britain responded with an embargo. Initially, the US did not fully support Britain's position and encourage a compromise, but as Iran's economic situation worsened and Mossadegh developed an alliance with Iran's communist movement, US attitudes changed dramatically. In August 1953, the CIA worked with Iranians opposed to Mossadegh in Operation Ajax. Mossadegh was successfully overthrown without American troops directly invading Iran. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, emerged with much greater authority and remained firmly in line with the West. From a narrow Cold War perspective, this looks extremely successful. The US prevented an important oil-producing country from potentially moving towards the USSR, but there was an obvious political cost. From the Iranian perspective, the US had helped overthrow their democracy and replace it with a dictatorship. So what looked like a short-term strategic success could damage the long-term American legitimacy. Throughout this time period, it was important to the US to contain Soviet influence. During the 1950s, the competition intensified. Turkey joined NATO in 1951. Syria developed increasing connections with the Soviet side, while Britain formed the Baghdad Pact in 1955 with Turkey, Iran, Iraq and Pakistan. The US gave the pact around $400 million. Eisenhower therefore took the basic principle of containment and applied it increasingly to the Middle East. This became explicit following Suez with the Eisenhower Doctrine in January 1957, which adapted the broader principles of the Truman Doctrine to the region by offering assistance to Middle Eastern governments resisting communist influence. But American attempts to contain Soviet influence were not completely successful. Egypt moved increasingly towards the Soviet Union. In July 1958, Iraq experienced a coup, and according to my notes, subsequently became another Soviet client state. The region was becoming a major arena of superpower competition. The Lebanon crisis of 1958 reveals the same contradiction seen in Iran. Lebanon's political system depended on a balance between different religious groups. As that balance became unstable and fears of Soviet involvement increased, US forces conducted an amphibious landing. The intervention helped protect the immediate political balance, but to other Arab countries it looked like an American imperial invasion. Alienating some of their very governments and populations, the US wanted to keep away from Soviet influence. Oil also became increasingly important. OPEC was formed in 1960, and the Middle East produced around 53% of the world's oil at the time. That made continued American influence strategically vital. By 1962, Yemen had become another proxy conflict. Egypt supported one side with Soviet backing, while Saudi Arabia received American support. So by early 1960s, American involvement had expanded enormously. Yet perhaps the clearest demonstration of both the power and limitations of American foreign policy had already occurred in 1956 with the Suez Canal crisis. As I mentioned, we'll be going into more detail into that now. Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser promoted pan-Arabism and resistance to foreign domination. Importantly, in the course material we've learnt about, Nasser is not presented simply as a communist puppet. He was a socialist nationalist who attempted to exploit the Cold War rivalry between the USSR and the US. One of his major projects was the Aswan Dam. The US and the World Bank offered financial assistance but attached conditions relating to Egypt's arms relationship with Czechoslovakia. Nasser reviews those conditions. American funding was withdrawn. Nasser then nationalized the Suez Canal, intending to use its revenues for Egypt. This directly challenged British and France interests. Britain in particular regarded the canal as central to its international position. The result was the Suez Crisis. Britain, France and Israel secretly coordinated through the Sèvres Protocol. Israel would invade Egypt. Britain and France would then intervene, supposedly to separate the combatants while moving into the canal zone. Militarily, the operation was working. Egyptian forces were being defeated, and Britain and France were capable of taking control of the canal area. So it's important not to describe this as though Eisenhower saved Britain and France from a military disaster, as that was not the case. The military operation itself had substantially achieved what Britain, France and Israel were trying to accomplish. What destroyed the operation was political pressure, above all from the United States. And that distinction matters enormously when judging American foreign policy. Eisenhower was furious that Britain and France had acted without properly consulting the US. In this reaction, it's arguable to say that there's arrogance in this reaction here from the US, as the US itself had increasingly used covert operations to achieve foreign policy goals. In Iran, it had participated in removing a government without publicly consulting the wider international community about whether that intervention was acceptable. American policy under Eisenhower increasingly relied upon precisely this kind of behind-the-scenes covert action. Yet when Britain and France, two major NATO allies, acted independently according to what they considered their national interests, the US reacted as though independent action by its allies was unacceptable. This reveals something important about the US's emerging leadership of the Western Bloc. The objection was not simply that Britain and France had used force. The US itself was willing to use intervention and coercion. The deeper issue was that Britain and France had done so without US approval. Therefore, Suez became partly a struggle over who actually controlled Western foreign policy. The US was upset that the UK and France hadn't consulted with the US before this, despite of course we know they were doing this already, so this problem becomes a protection of US ego. Eisenhower had enormous economic leverage. Rather than directly attacking Britain or France, the US used political and financial pressure. Britain was particularly vulnerable. The US could refuse financial assistance and place severe pressure on the British economy and currency. After World War II, the UK and its empire had started to crumble. Therefore, the UK was in particularly an economic weakness area. Israel also was pressured to withdraw. Egypt therefore retained control of the canal. From the standpoint of American power, This was an extraordinarily demonstration of dominance. A generation earlier, Britain and France had been the leading outside powers in the Middle East. After Suez, it became unmistakable that they could no longer conduct major regional policy against the wishes of the US. So Suez was certainly a success for American supremacy within the Western Alliance. But was it actually successful for Middle Eastern foreign policy? That is much harder to defend. One of Eisenhower's major concerns was credibility. The US wanted newly independent countries to believe that the US represented something different from traditional European colonialism. This was particularly important because the Soviet Union could point to British and French actions and accuse the West of imperialism. So forcing Britain and France out was supposed to protect America's image. But the problem is that it did not solve the underlying issue. Egypt did not consequently become a reliable American partner. Instead, Egypt moved further towards the Soviet Union. Soviet support was ultimately helped fund the Aswan Dam, the very project over which American relations with Nasser had deteriorated. So the US inflicted an enormous political defeat upon its closest European allies in order partly to prevent Soviet influence in Egypt. And Egypt moved closer to Moscow anyway. This is hardly an uncomplicated foreign policy success. And the problems did not end at Suez. The US now had to fill much of the vacuum left by weakened British and French power. That contributed to the Eisenhower Doctrine, through which America accepted much greater responsibility for resisting Soviet influence in the Middle East. Then came instability in Iraq, then direct US intervention in Lebanon. And ironically, the American landing in Lebanon was itself regarded by other Arab states as imperialistic. So Eisenhower's attempt at Suez to establish America as a respectable anti-imperialist alternative to Britain and France did not permanently resolve the Western image problem. America increasingly inherited the exact problem Britain had faced. How do you maintain strategic control of the Middle East without appearing to the people living there as an outside power interfering in their politics? The US never really solved that contradiction during this period. So this brings us to the conclusion of this video. How successful was American foreign policy in the Middle East between 1945 and 1965? It was certainly successful at accumulating power. Operation Ajax helped keep Iran aligned with the US. Suez demonstrated that British and France could no longer conduct independent Middle Eastern policy against American wishes. The Eisenhower Doctrine expanded America's regional role, and American forces could intervene directly when the US considered the political balance threatened. But power is not the same as successful influence. The US condemned British and French intervention while engaging in intervention of its own. It claimed to oppose imperialism while supporting authoritarian allies and interfering in other states. And at Suez, the US successfully dismantled a military successful operation by its own allies, partly in the hope of protecting Western credibility and limiting Soviet influence. Yet Egypt moved closer to the USSR anyway. The result was therefore deeply ironic. Suez was a triumph of American power, but a much weaker triumph of American foreign policy. By 1965, the US had increasingly replaced Britain and France as the dominant Western actor in the Middle East. But in doing so, the US also inherited many of the same accusations of interference, imperialism, and political hypocrisy that it condemned at Suez. And that's why the greatest American success of the period can also be read as evidence of the limitations of American strategy.